For those who's coming, we will start in 5 minutes. And thank you for waiting.
Hi, Professor Zhou.
I seem to have trouble getting, I was waiting to be let in, so nice to see you. Let me, while you start, I'm gonna do some technical thing and join on my other computer as well.
Great, so. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much. And so sorry for the brief wait for everybody. And without further ado, I'm gonna just do a brief introduction for our guests tonight and give you a sense of what we will be hearing from them. So tonight we have with us Professor Ying Zhou, who is an architect and urban theorist and currently assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong. Her research on the urban transformations of Shanghai, contextualizing contemporary developments in the institutional frameworks and historical legacies of the city, was published in 2017 as the book Urban Loopholes, Creative Alliances of Spatial Productions in Shanghai's City Center. Professor Zhou also researches and writes about heritage conservation, architectural reuse, gentrification, and creative cities. And as you know, these are topics that are of high interest to the contemporary Chinese urban landscape. Her writings appear in Critical Planning, MONU, Urban China, Leap, and Art Journal, among others. She has exhibited at the Rotterdam and Shenzhen Architecture Biennales, Munich's Haus der Kunst, the Swiss Architecture Museum, among others as well. Prior to joining Hong Kong University, Ying was the coordinator for the urban design module at the Future Cities Laboratory of the Singapore ETH Center, the ASEC, between 2011 and 2015, with the chair of Kees Christians, and lecturer with the chair of Herzog and de Meuron at ETH Studio Basel Contemporary City Institute between 2007 and 2011, where she led urban research on Singapore, Kolkata, and so on. She earned her BSc at Princeton, her MArch here at the Harvard GSD, and her PhD at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. So I will leave the introduction of your topic to you, Professor Zhou. And again, thank you very much tonight for being with us.
Thank you so much for the chance to be here, especially to Claude and Yusing for the organization and the discussions along the way. So let me, give me 1 second to share my screen. Can you see?
Yeah, we have it. Although it might be good for you to just bring it up to full screen if that's possible.
Yep. Okay, there's a slight lag, but it's great. So thank you for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here back at the GSD to be sharing a bit of an ongoing research and forthcoming, actually 2 publications to see in a way why it had been conceived as one and now it's becoming 2. And I also wanted to introduce Jane and George. Jane is also at the GSD who will be taking part in the conversation after my 20-minute introduction to the project itself. They have been kind of key members of the research team, and I think it's a very, many of the questions they've been asking along the way, I think is a part of the reason why I thought this would be great to be sharing with everyone. So I think in some ways, the pandemic gave us and still gives us a chance to be together, especially across time zones and oceans. But nevertheless, I think especially for designers and professionals and disciplinarians in the built environment, both here and at the GSD, these 2 years have really pointed out the importance of physical space, which is, of course, our specialty. And here we see, I start always with this image, the exhibition of the French artist Sophie Calle, which took place at the Power Station of Art. It was part of the 9th Shanghai Biennale entitled Reactivation, and it had been the first edition to show in the PSA that opened on October 1st, 2012. So if you look at this image, in a way, this is kind of the spatial experience, the encounter with aesthetic, that, without me telling you that is taking place in this particular place, we can imagine it could be in London, New York, Paris, many of these other cities. The space, down, is one of the representative new public museums that opened in the region in the last decade or so. Here you see the space actually in the building identified on the left, which was, of course, designed by the Shanghainese architect Zhang Min. In the middle is a National Gallery that opened in 2015 in Singapore. And on the right, you see M+, the large new museum designed by architect that just opened last year in Hong Kong. This rise of these new art spaces seem to confirm what's been called the Global East Museum boom. And that has been extensively reported in international media, from New York Times to Wall Street Journal. Yes, I'll talk a bit louder, thank you. These spaces also speak to a kind of inter-regional competition where culture is a software for attracting talent, and with it, of course, investment. Here we see Hertog Demeron's design, which won the competition for the M+ Museum in 2012. It is today one of the largest public spaces that is not a private shopping mall, very unique, in the commercially oriented and real estate expensive Hong Kong. This is my own snapshot. So you can see also it's part of this larger West Kowloon development and the lovely public space, which is actually super populated, especially on the weekends, with children and dogs and families all picnicking outside. The M+ itself is conceived as a public museum for the collection of contemporary visual culture. So from visual art to design to moving image. The slide is a bit slow. As a space, as an institution, the museum itself is, of course, a spatial type and an institutional form that originates epistemologically in the conceptions for society under Western modernity. In the collecting, organizing, cataloging, and in a way creating a taxonomy of disciplinary knowledge, an order of things, a la Michel Foucault, of course, the philosopher. The museum is a repository of knowledge in this collection of material artifacts. The museum, along with the schools, the libraries, the universities, are types mandated by the dissemination of knowledge through public education. And this is based on the very belief that knowledge betters modern society. If we zoom out to the larger transformations taking place, set in a way the classical economic timeline defining what is modern, what is being modernized or industrialized and developed in terms of economics. The relationship between modernity, where industrialization, mass production and consumption, urbanization, technological advances in architecture, you all know the book with the title The Machine Age on it. Right? This modernity fundamentally changed our social structures and the way we conceive of many of these relationships. This particular relationship between modernity and the emergence of these repositories of knowledge that better society become clearer when we see, for example, on this timeline, the kind of sections of the Louvre and the Metropolitan Museum, which are today unquestioningly the typological embodiment of what is a museum. Artifacts such as dinosaur bones, fossil rocks, prehistorical pottery, and even classical paintings and sculptures are obvious in the museum. But what about the outputs of the contemporary visual cultures by living artists? Initially, the avant-garde artists of the modern era had protested the inclusion of their outputs in such places. They resisted the museumification of their works. But actually, in time, the museum also took on the public role or responsibility to select and distinguish between valuable contemporary outputs to keep for posterity. In the process, of course, we're talking about the creation of the canon. Eventually, even the critique of the institution, which is, of course, is a movement from the 60s after the war, became part of the canonical. New York's MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, and Paris's Pompidou Center are, of course, exemplary in the selecting and collecting and conservation, of course, of contemporary art. So what happens? That's our question, right? It's good. What happens when we now add to the formula the so-called developing or emerging economies? One has to remember also in the construction of that very cultural canon, these places in the non-West were not even part of the story until the mid-1980s. We witness, for example, here, the recent arrival of these spaces and institutions in the last 3 decades. The very first plans and sections I show you, of course, are the same spaces. To table the relationship of culture to development, development to modernity, and culture to modernity is also to repeat that we cannot simply copy-paste what has taken place. After the 2008 global financial crisis, the stability of the art market in the region, East Asia, mainly because of China, started to alert the world also to the rise of the economic cloud of this very global East. We are reminded by this artprice.com report from 2012 that the artwork is not only a public good, as I've already mentioned, that is collected and preserved in the museum since modernity. The artwork is also and has always been an apex commodity that is exchanged with economic value. As architects, this project that I'm introducing, we're looking at, of course, I showed you these 3 museums through the lens of space and a commonality in some ways of the type in the 3 different cities. What we can also see it is not only this type that is studied, but the relationships in the entire ecology. The palette of architectural types also form a larger picture of the way culture is related to development and development to the conceptions, of course, of the social contract. If we zoom into Shanghai, for example, we see an interaction between economic development, the policies that have been in place since modernity, as well as the rise of the new spaces in the ecology, from production to exhibition to consumption. So as you can see, of course, the ecology is not singular. It's made up of the entire value chain that makes possible this art world. From the art historical perspective also, it should be noted that it was only in the 1990s that the non-Western began to be accepted as contemporary. It was a scathing critique of a show at the MoMA in 1984 that awoke this postmodern consciousness of the non-Western, which had, of course, been previously conceived of as the other, which were considered as either traditional or otherwise derivatives of the West. So in this, the rise of Chinese contemporary art coincided, of course, with reform and opening in the 1980s and a growing circulation of Chinese contemporary artists' works internationally in the 1990s, which you can see from these very seminal, early, almost pioneering catalogs. So it should not be surprising that there would follow eventually a rise also in the institutions and spaces that would become repositories for these aesthetic objects. There are existing theories from urbanism or geography that often critique what is called, quote, culture-led creative economies. But in this simultaneity of development and culture, actually, in these in the region that we're witnessing, these developments should not be merely alibis for local development, but in fact, they could be considered more a range between culture-led to space-led cultural developments, especially since these cultural spaces also bear the responsibility, whether they like it or not, of publicness and civicness in the city. So architecture in the city. We know from the built environment perspective, of course, the built environment architecture, urbanism physically manifests the rapid and astounding economic transformations that have taken place. Artists such as Thomas Struth, also who is also a close collaborator with Herzog Demeron, was able to capture this kind of moving target that was rapidly changing from the 1990s already. So this you can see is, of course, an image taken from 1999 called entitled Pudong. This is Lu Jiazui under construction. But it wasn't only the Western artists. Here we have a piece by Chinese artist Yang Fudong from 2000 called The First Intellectual. And it certainly showed that there was a growing awareness of the rapidness of China's urban transformations that was taking place through the lens of many of these visual artists that were working and increasingly globally connected on the scene. As architects rush on the bandwagon of constructing this very future, artists have been witness to its impact in ways that architects somehow, in the rush, have somewhat overlooked, probably because there's just too much work to be done, too many drawings, too many construction administrations, and so on and so forth. And here you see Xiao Hong's Red Brick, a painting that really focuses on the elements of construction, of course, for us, but also what the meaning of these pieces are in the city itself. So this very awareness and consciousness in the visual arts is in a way also a tie to architecture as a discipline. And here you see two pieces from Zhang Dali, again on the left. You see Lu Jiazui in the background, really calling out what has been profound in urban transitions in the Chinese cities. So as much of the city was being demolished, especially city center industrial buildings to make space for new economic imperatives and global integration, in which, of course, the Art Biennale became also itself a very strong marker. It was the artists who took on these industrial spaces initially. The red house made of bricks on the left, recalling the bricks that from the painting before, and of course the brick in the young man's hand in Yang Fudong's painting, is the site of a counter biennale from 2000 along the Suzhou Creek. It is as if the artists were ahead of their time, even more than architects, in their interim use of these functionally obsolete industrial spaces and making use of these spatial qualities in their events and exhibitions that take place. There's a much larger backstory that I don't have time to tell you here, but I hope you're interested in reading more about each of these vignettes in the forthcoming books. The artists using raw high ceiling spaces that were abandoned by the former factories. And of course, this is something that we as architects also produce physicality and designs understand the importance of space to the act of creation itself. So here you see a documentation of one of the artist spaces in Hong Kong studios. The artist Daniel Bjorn had already written about the transformation of the art pieces from the space of the maker to that of the exhibition and the kind of whole value chain that exists between. From the space of the studio to the exhibition, of course, those transformations fundamental in its meaning in society. And when we put, for example, the artist studio and the museum side by side, as you see here on the left and right, we see that there is also an ecology or value chain from this production system to the museum itself, which is a kind of pinnacle repository, because the value imparted on the work through its inclusion in the museum then also elevates its contribution to society. With a growing body of media, of course, beyond painting and classical sculpture itself, the scale of the artwork has also been growing in the last 3 decades. This is an artwork, clearly this is Confucius by the artist Zhang Huan, who is very much known for his ash paintings at the Rockbund Art Museum. See in this image the relationship of the piece to its context, but then one can imagine this also harking to cultural history and the scale of this human figure. Right? This is a 5-meter space in which part of Confucius is in. Also talks, especially to designer, about the scale required of an artist studio that could produce such a work. So space again becomes very important. Studios that have changed as a result of the artwork or the demands for the artwork, from installation to new media, is very much part of what we're looking at in research. So here you can see the studio scales of a painter studios on the left, and then on the left, in the center and the right are 2 small studios, or they're actually very large studios by Hong Kong and Singapore standards that are in former industrial buildings. So this idea of industrial reuse, or what is called the loft, has been an idea that's been prevalent, of course, since modernity. But of course, we are very aware that limitations of property prices and property rights in the different cities also become visible, not only in the artworks that are the final outputs, but also the spaces of their productions. If we zoom out a little bit from the architecture to the urban scale, and look at the urban contexts of these artist spaces, we see in Shanghai the reuse of industrial buildings and the redevelopment of industrial areas. Those not demolished because being what is called, being on what is called allocated land from the planned economy. So here we see 2 cases of what is today known as M50 on the left, which began in the 1990s, and on the right, what is today known as Westbund on the right, which began in 2010s after the expo. Both are products of the industrialization of the city under modernity, which shaped in a way a kind of fundamental urban morphology. And both are located on the water bodies because of their industrial and transportational nature. So you see a 1930s historical shot of the river, the Huangpu River and the Suzhou Creek. Longhua, which is where today Westbund is located, and it had been called Longhua for a long time until it became rebranded, had been an intermodal transport hub bringing together air, water, and rail transport together. So here you would have found coal transportation facilities, cement factories, oil tanks, as well as some of the first of China's domestic airplane industries. They really tried for a long time to design a domestic aircraft, actually in the facilities here. Moganshan Road, on the other hand, had been where the textile industries, flour mills, warehouses had been along the Suzhou Creek. And so the kind of original differences, nevertheless, in some ways, the spaces converge in the sense that the kind of deindustrialization of the cities has led to kind of an obsolescence of their former functions. So the spaces from these industrial origins meant they were informal, rather under the radar, and very unpolished and wide. They were also, as a consequence, quite cheap, and especially in how much space they can afford. And for that, perhaps you can say a bit grungy. And in many ways, they were perfectly suited to the artistic production. And this is something that is very hard to convince, especially administrators in places like Hong Kong and Singapore, because there's kind of an incomprehensibility to understand and the kind of desire to over-design artistic spaces. And it is in such spaces a kind of reflection on the rapid transformations taking place outside in the city that can take place. Here you see 2 paintings from Cui Jie, artist based in Shanghai, very large scale paintings, reflecting on the very symbolism and architectonics of the early Reform era buildings, as well as the sculptures that kind of exuded this optimism toward the future. So space is clearly not only a container, but also impacts the reading perceptions of the works that are curated in them. Here you see a diversity of exhibition spaces from Shanghai, the bunker, and we're going left to right, the leftover stairs, the former dinosaur mammoth exhibition hall, and the former airplane hangar. If we zoom into one of a few of these spaces, flipping stuff, yes. This is again a documentation from us of a piece by Yang Fuzhong made for PSA's 2018 Shanghai Biennale. It's very contextual in using a leftover stair that had been important to the circulation of crowds in PSA's previous incarnation as a Future Cities gallery during 2010 Shanghai Expo. And this is, of course, after the building's initial conversion from being a power station itself. Here's another image of the opening sequence. For the opening, students from the Central Academy of Fine Arts had been engaged to descend unsmilingly down what had been these grand staircases. So you can see the kind of site specificity of the stair, and then, of course, recalling the kind of obsolescence of a former use, in this case, a very recent former use, and how the artist carved out this to remake its importance in the building. On the other hand, you see the YUZ Museum, which is today a private museum opened by the collector Budi Tek, who's an Indonesian Chinese entrepreneur. He had engaged Sue Fujimoto to design the renovation of a former plane hangar built in 1954, which was key in China's domestic air industry to conceive and build a domestic aircraft. And you see here we document, of course, and also the photo of this documentation of the pieces that were part of the opening exhibition. Zhang Huan's tobacco, it's actually Xu Bing's tobacco project. You see Zhang Huan's big Buddha hand on the left, Sun Yuan and Pen Yu's freedom on the very left. And what's interesting, if you look at the plan, of course, is that in the center, there's a piece by the French artist Abdesamed, which is recalling the airplane hangar in the kind of reforming of the airplane, and that you see in the center of the image. And so in this space, of course, these large scale pieces are extremely large, do not feel outscaled at all, because the space had of course, been its former use suited in some ways, the kind of spectacularness of these media. So again, you can see this kind of always looking very closely at exactly what happens. So for architects, the function and form, right? So galleries here, you see the palette of art galleries, so not museums anymore, that take place in old buildings, going from left to right, and new buildings in the ground floor of a Lilong house, in a new glass tower, and in a historical tower. And you see the nature of space in relation, of course, to their art pieces, but also the nature of space also to the larger context. Most interesting out of this research is that for abiders of classical etiquettes of high culture, they would be very shocked to see the kinds of unconventional spaces for art that are kind of being pioneered. And here are three instances from Shanghai: the leftover underground commercial spaces, the underground former parking, that is today it remains today part of a commercial tower. And on the right, you see the carving out of an office hotel building, actually for an art hotel. Entirely, not abiding by the existing etiquettes on art or high culture. But when we look closely at their functions, the kinds of exhibitions that take place in such spaces, we also see that the new media installation in particular seem to take very well onto these unique building types that are in some ways very Asian. And here are some of the examples of they're all underground spaces and how they have been reconceived in relation to these particular exhibitions. So the diversity of spaces may not reflect a diversity of institutional types necessarily, as these are including the institutional frameworks, but they definitely offer a choice and encountering for the public of high culture itself. And for us, what is clear is that space is very important to understanding the rise of these arts ecology, and this cross-disciplinarity of this analysis is also very crucial as part of the research project. So this is just a very short kind of giving you a glimpse of what the research is about. And I end on this image. So maybe I can introduce George and Jane as well.
Hello, I'm George.
Hi, Jane.
Ying, thanks for the talk.
Yeah, thanks for the
No,
presentation.
thank you. No, thank you all for being here in the audience, because we have a small audience, we can make it a little more informal too. So Yixing and Claude also, pipe in when you have questions. We plan some kind of key ideas to kind of discuss, and we can go to some images to go a bit deeper.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
So Ying, since the topics of your talk suggests it's about art space typology, and then in your talk there are some obviously there are these art spaces that you talked about, and then the typology concept you want to bring about. But I was just thinking, so normally nowadays when people talk about art spaces, there are some typical images that come to our mind once someone mentioned this. Maybe it's a more of a conventional museum, white cube, or some cleaner spaces that people usually associated with people taking photos of themselves, posting on Instagram and all that. But all these sort of comes up from, if we go back to your timeline, that how initially museum or these institutions are somehow set it up by the state or by the government for the public and all that. But now in your research that we probe into these Asian or East Asian cities, we start to see these different types of spaces that sort of mutate from other kind of function or be just taken over by the artist or some gallery that are also called either museum, galleries, or art spaces, event spaces, and all that. I just wonder if you have any more observations that you want to bring into some of these examples, and maybe you could introduce slightly more about some of the examples and how these art transforms in these art spaces, and maybe how the artist has utilized these. Yeah,
so we're getting into a kind of very specific question about the type, which is something that I think designers often feel, oh, we know about the type. And in particular, I'm talking about the relationship between function and form. So, the idea that, because when we say the English word museum, there's already, because all of us have been to some classical ones like the Met or the Louvre, or even the MoMA or the Pompidou, we kind of feel that, oh, we all know what that is. But what's very interesting is that when the word museum comes to, for example, Shanghai, it's not only a matter of translation, because in Chinese, of course, it's 博物馆, and there's books about the origin with the word, and it's kind of coming to China by way of these world expos that were taking place in the 1900s, right? So really this idea of collecting and showcasing artifacts. But then, you know, and then within this palette of museums, there is, in particular here, we're talking about art, visual art. So this kind of what is contemporary, you know, like 14th century Song, is a Song? No, it's much later. 14th century's Ming painting. We know it's like it belongs in the museum. But what happens when it's like a 1990s you know, installation piece? So I think this is a larger question of what goes into that building that's called a museum, and usually has a building. And then I think the other part of your question has to do with the kind of institution of it, right? Because a lot of these museums were formulated, as I mentioned, in relation, it's like the school or the library, but it's the highest level because it has the actual thing. It's very educational, and it is supposed to be the ultimate judge of values, right? If you get selected into the museum, you're like, you know, your work is forever kept. And if you're in the collection of the MoMA, you know, if you're an architect, right, you know, like, must be good. So these kind of responsibilities also come with a museum, but what's very interesting is that this kind of epistemological attachment to these original meanings may not necessarily be in the minds of many of the establishers of some of these contemporary museums. And in fact, even in the PSA or NGS or M+, which are the kind of, you know, representative, we're using them because they're the three big ones from the three big cities. For example, PSA doesn't even have much of a collection yet. And compared to a lot of the private museums that are taking place in Shanghai, which begins because it's a private collection and then you kind of make a building for it more formally. So this we're really getting into kind of the existing aggregates, and then what happens when everything is new and everything is optimistic in a context like Shanghai, where, you know, yes, we're going to make a museum. It's really great because everything we know about the museum, but not really necessarily having to follow, you know, all those conventions, you can say, or etiquettes. I think, Jane, you can pipe in too, because you were looking at quite a lot at the registration.
Yes.
Of
Yes.
yes.
So I'm quite curious about your position about this kind of generalization of the definition of the museum in the Eastern context, because as you have just mentioned, like the first aspect is that for many of the industrial spaces which get renovated into art space, like they are not like a new space made just for exhibiting art. They are more like the artists know that, okay, I will do an exhibition here and the space is like this, and I will do an artwork to accommodate the space. So that's one aspect. And the other is that since I kind of see it more as a problem that's since like for all these three cities that we have looked at, it was around 2000 that the government really gave an importance to the development of the art industry and the establishment of all those new museums. And during the process, there's actually a lot of miss out of the regulations. For instance, it was not until 2000 that China had its first regulation on the registration and administration of private non-profit organizations for culture. Museums want this registration because it will qualify for some funding and exemption of tax payment, but the registration process is really complex and takes a long time, and it requires the museum to be like registered under a local cultural department and receive their supervision, but then the local officials are often reluctant to take on the responsibilities to manage them. And also in practice, the support from the government is actually very limited. They don't have enough funding for them. So it's kind of like, I'm wondering like in the future, whether we'll have more regulations to smooth out all those registration and everything to provide more like healthy environment for the art museums there, or we'll just accept that there are just all these different kinds of museums in the Eastern context and let them do the thing.
I think what you're getting at is because the nature of so Jane is mentioning this kind of nonprofit registration, right? But if we look at many of the private museums that call themselves museums, they're actually registered as commercial entities. So they're with the commercial bureau, and they're actually, a limited company because that's the easier way, because they just want to get their art exhibited and do stuff, and then, to go through the process that Jane you just mentioned, because the PSA is the first officially, it's actually not the first, but it's interesting because it's because if you look at Hexiang in Shenzhen or the OCAT, they're also central government recognized, but the PSA is the first 博物馆 that has contemporary art. That's its kind of remit. And so everyone's like, oh, 2012, finally, we can have a museum of contemporary art instead of just all the art. But I think in terms of the future, I think we can't really predict it because clearly there's a lot more important things to deal with than having some artworks in a building so people can go see it, right? There's COVID right now, and there's economics, GDP growth. These all take precedence. But I think what you are also bringing up is really how, because under modernity, art is seen as very important, along with public education. So Cai Renpei wrote this very short piece about why aesthetic education is important, and that led to the founding of the China, what today is known as the China Academy, 中国美院, and that was the first kind of public investment in the education, aesthetic education. And of course, he was very much thinking of what's happening in the West, right? Because the idea that if you can know what beauty is makes you a better person. There's something kind of fundamental that is not even spoken about. Like, why do we want to have art or poetry or music? Because it makes you a better person in society. And that's a fundamental presumption that's built into what is art for in society. And if that is valuable in a way that's not economically measurable, then of course, the public investment in these, this kind of repository of knowledge, as I call it, would come into place. But if there's other priorities that take precedence, then, there's other important things. So it's really how society views it. But then in this case, the contemporary case, what's very interesting is that in place of these public museums, because I already mentioned PSA doesn't have a collection or not much of one, even though the mandate of a museum is to collect for posterity, right? That you have all these other private collectors who are showing their works to the public, even though of course you have to get a ticket for the loan is quite expensive. The YVZ, I forgot how much. But that's why they start to also take on these civic public functions if we go back to that presumption that fundamentally the more people who can appreciate art will make for a better society.
Yeah, I think, but it's also curious, although Jane is mentioning these regulations that sort of come slightly later and somehow maybe some of those are unregulated or there's no correct way to forward apart. But at least from some of our observations of these past years, if we just compare these three cities, Shanghai, Singapore, and Hong Kong, somehow Shanghai has the most diverse
Spaces.
spaces compared to Hong Kong and Singapore. For
Yes.
example, you will see all these private museums that set it up by private collectors in Shanghai, but in Singapore or Hong Kong,
Yes.
they
don't exist.
Yeah, they don't use this museum term, and then they're mostly also gallery that they are there to make a profit,
Yes.
but at the same time, they also brought in a lot of Western canon works, at least for people like me to be able to see without going to Europe or the US. I think that's another side of things that, I mean, as a person living here, I just kind of appreciate. Yeah, it also comes back to saying that somehow these either galleries or museum that somehow also take on the responsibility of providing these public goods or educating somehow, although maybe sometimes educating their potential buyers.
Yes.
Not, yeah.
Marketing, it's a marketing.
Yeah.
But in the end, it's almost like if the end justifies the means, if we can think of it like that, right? Because it's more that, if we look at what George is saying, that in Hong Kong, other than M+, the other spaces are all not museums. There is a Hong Kong Art Museum, but the kind of private museums that we include, especially in our cases, like the RAC here in Shanghai, you see the YUZ Museum, the RACBAN, the OCAT, the HOW, and K11 also calls itself a museum, the Chi K11 Art Museum. It's I think that's also where your question comes from. Everybody calls themselves a museum, but they're actually not. Is that okay, right? But as a result, you have very different kinds of, even spatially, but also institutionally, because the YUZ is a private collector. RACBAN doesn't have a collection, but it's in a beautiful old building and both RACBAN and OCAT are non-collecting, but OCAT doesn't call itself a museum. And they're both kind of art spaces that are attached to real estate developers. So the RACBAN group and OCAT to the OCT group. And then HOW itself is part of the HOW hotel, and the development is part of it is it's office tower and hotel, and then in between is a museum. So spatially, and K11 is a big tower with the parking space carved out for art. So I think you're absolutely right that in some ways this is creating a diversity spatially, but also in terms of the content. Even if, for example, the K11 brings in the Monet show, right? The second blockbuster Monet show. I think the ticket was very expensive too, but they sold out immediately because everybody wanted to see Monet. So that's also, I think part of your question is also this kind of global, local aspect in terms of, how much local artists do we need to show, and what about the Picassos and Monets and these famous ones? Do they belong outside, or do we only show them through the galleries, which they do in Hong Kong? Or do we kind of really collect them? Because of course the Met, MoMA, some of the, if we look at New York, of course it has the Whitney, the MoMA, the Guggenheim, the Metropolitan, what is that, the Sana building called? I only remember the building, not the name of the art space. They all do kind of different things, right? So that diversity is actually,
Yeah.
So, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's fine. I was just thinking maybe we could open some questions to
yes.
audience, if any.
Yeah, we have got many questions from the audience, and one of the audience would like to hear Professor Joe's elaborate more on the question of what are the specificities that distinguish these recent developments from those in the developed political economies, largely of the West. So the question that you mentioned in your introduction of the lecture, they are really interested about hearing more about it.
So what's different from what's existing, right? I think we mentioned already the kind of institutional understanding of a museum. So, and you know, the museums have a special status if it's registered. Let's say in New York, you say, I want to start a museum. There's a whole set of processes that everyone has gone through. But if you want to do that in Shanghai, as Jane mentioned, since very recently, I think 2012 was when OCAT registered itself as a nonprofit. So you can either, if you're a private entity, you can either register yourself as a company to do the museum thing, or you can, after I think around the late 2000s, the first one was a museum in Beijing that managed to register as a nonprofit. So this is increasingly becoming, approved because the process is more tedious. So that fundamentally changes the operation of the museum. And then spatially, it's interesting because, so on the one hand, you have this institutionalness, and on the other hand, you also have, so if we're going to go between space and institution and space, if you're the architect, for example, for a museum on West Fund, you are not hired by the museum usually. So I don't know if the question is coming from the architect, because in the West, you have the client who's a collector, they're going to hire you. But in Shanghai, at least in the West Fund, you'll be hired by the West Fund group. That's your client, even though you're designing for the guy who has a lot of stuff that he wants to show, or he wants to make, or he or she wants to, or both of them, wants to make a space for doing exhibitions. So that nature also speaks to the land ownerships in Shanghai in particular, but probably you can say in Chinese cities, so that you have this interesting alliance between the public and private. So I think for those who are taking Gerald's class, you can raise your hand and say, what happens, what does this mean? Because it's definitely a private-public alliance. The West Fund Group invites private collectors when they were developing Longhua and rebranding as West Fund to come locate your museum, come locate here. We build you a museum. You pay for it, but we're the client, right? That's great. And then you get a museum, but some of them are leased. So you might get kicked out anytime. And that's also inconceivable. Imagine a museum then poof, gone, right? So, but then it gives you a freedom if you're ready for that mindset. So I think it's a question of timeline, because if you build a museum, the origin of the museum is permanent. Like you're collecting all the stuff, right? And only if you go to the Met, only 10% of the things are on display. 90% are in storage, MoMA, all those. You don't see everything. They're collecting for posterity. They're collecting because that thing in 20 years will mean something about that 20 years ago. So that is something that's fundamentally very modern era in that conception. So that permanence is built in. It's like an archive. You're saving this thing. You're picking that thing. So the other stuff can go to private collectors, and then it might get sold and you never know where it is and you never see it. But this belongs to the public. So the museum itself comes a bit with that conception. And that conception may not necessarily be feasible in a place where impermanence, uncertainty is still very much the certainty. So that's the second aspect. And I think the third aspect where it's different is certainly the space. So I think I showed some strange, not strange, but just unusual types. I already mentioned that they're very, you know, to an art aficionado, it's like, what? You would put this is these kinds of spaces, right? That are quite unusual, yet they do what they do. It's available, and you know, it's not freshly designed, some of them, and some are, but they, you know, if you want to do a voice exhibition and you have the stuff and you have the space, it's there. If you want to see Joseph Boyce, quite a very beautiful collection. Yeah.
So
I hope that answers.
oh,
Yes.
go ahead.
Go ahead, Claude. Yes.
So I just wanted to also kind of connect to that question a little bit, which is often when we talk about, you know, the kind of museum boom in East Asian cities, we're often talking about sort of the boom of the physical museum or sort of art spaces, really. And often there's a bit of, you know, like you've mentioned, when new museum is built, there's also the need to sort of facilitate that institution as an organization, as a body of work that is being actively collected and curated. I just want to sort of probe that direction a little bit. And what are some sort of the practices that you've surveyed in terms of collecting? Because that's a really daunting task for a new either gallery or museum, oftentimes with, you know, limited resources, and part of that is being committed to sort of the space itself. So
Yes.
what do they collect? How do they collect
Yes.
them? Are we talking about
Yes.
auctions, local artists?
Yes.
Love to hear
Yes.
that. Thank you.
Yes. No, that's a great question. The content, right? Because if we're going to give form, we better know what kind of function it's for. That's also the very difficulty very often for architects designing, because the brief is usually very imprecise, like, oh, make me a museum. You know, I want it to look good. And then you're like, but what do you have? What kind of, is it installations? Is it new media? Is it paintings and sculpture? Because the scale of the spaces are extremely different, right? The storage, the conservation, the whole kind of back of house actually for all of those. The collection itself, I think, as I kind of alluded to, the private collectors, they're mostly very recent. So since the 2010s, at least in the private museums that we're seeing. So YUZ is a very exemplary example, because with the advice of Wu Hong, who is the premier art historian of Chinese contemporary art, based out of the University of Chicago, you know, he was able to advise Goody Tech in, you know, these are the pieces. Of course, the final decisions made by the collector, him or herself. The How Museum I mentioned is they acquired a collection of Joseph Boyce, for example. And I think in terms of actually the collecting, sometimes it's, we can say serendipity, right? You're at the right place at the right time and you acquire it. And then you think about, so it's not, but I think if you are collecting as a museum, then the responsibility of being the arbitrator of value comes in. So the collection, you know, the curatorial responsibility is actually because you are collecting as an institution. So Uli Sieg, who the Swiss ambassador who spent decades in China and then who began collecting Chinese contemporary art starting in the 80s already, when nobody was, you know, traveling in China. He often says he tries to collect not like a private person, because I like this kind of, you know, art, or I like this body of work, I like this artist. But he tries to think like an institution because he felt that responsibility that nobody else was doing that. So he didn't collect things that necessarily he liked, but he was thinking about what that would mean 50 years down the line. And that's not actually so easy to both have the financial means to do that. As you can see, public museums are not endowed with huge funds, at least of yet, to buy as much as they can for that posterity. But on the other hand, you also have to have that judgment, and that takes manpower. And so M+, for example, there's many complaints from local artists who say, how come you're not hiring locals to work in M+ as curators, as well, there is not a curatorial program that could train this kind of profession, right? Yeah, so it's all linked, because it's education, production, the whole value. It's not just the museum and then you just bring stuff in and then that's it, done. It takes, and you can see the collection of the Louvre belonged to the French royal family, and they didn't do it in one shot either. It took, any museum's collections, that classical, they probably took a long time. So it cannot be rushed. And that timeline is also hard for administrators to understand. They just want, KPI, 5 years, better, check, check, check. But, not like that. It's a long-term investment with returns that are not economic immediately. Yeah. Great,
thank you for that perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much. And so here comes the last questions. So and all this is really interesting about, like, when we think about the museums, we think about the exhibitions, and then we can link towards the idea of expos and also World's Fair in the past. So he's really interested about like how you see the role, the educational or cultural role of today's art spaces or museums, and how they can learn from maybe the expos or World's Fair in the past, and also what should this art space contribute to the civilized process of global cities? Thank you.
Well, I think expos and World's Fairs are more, there is contemporary equivalence, but also, as I mentioned, what's very interesting about art is that it has this public tenant, right? We think the aesthetic object is good for society, therefore we should provide it so people can access it to make them better, like the schools. But on the other hand, it's always been a commodity. And so the kind of original conceptions of the World's Fair was economic, right? Of course, you're showing off stuff, but it's all to promote this kind of globalization of trade and goods. And art is definitely the pinnacle of that. It's not only just because it's expensive, but and it is expensive, the good ones, or the so-called good ones, but also because its value has nothing, it's not equivalent to the labor cost from economic terms. So you're also not buying it because, oh, that takes like $1 to make, but it's by this like famous person. So of course it's worth like $1 million, a million times more, because you got the signature. And Joseph Beuys makes fun of that all the time, because it defies the logic of the market in a sense. It's not a pure kind of supply demand. So within this, what we don't look into is, of course, the art market itself. And I think, Claude, you mentioned this collecting, like, do you buy it from Christie, Sotheby's, Polly? Who do you buy it from? Where does it come from? How is it sold? There is this whole ecology, of course, of that commodity good. And I'm not sure if that will, at least in the study, it's a bit outside of the scope. We're not looking at that influence. We're only looking at, let's say, the public dimension of it. But there is the art fairs. Art Basel comes every year to Hong Kong, and it had thought for a long time to locate in Shanghai, because the market is clearly Chinese. It's a very large market. Singapore started its own version with a former director of Basel, but then it closed 2 years ago before the pandemic, not because of the pandemic, but for other reasons. And then you see also there's 2 or 3 art fairs in Shanghai taking place itself. And so this whole kind of, we're not looking at that kind of spaces because the art fairs themselves are, of course, very, they take place over shorter amounts of time, but they are actually super influential. But what we do look at is, of course, the gallery spaces, because these are the more kind of permanent spaces where the interactions happen. And as I think George also mentioned, a lot of the galleries, especially the big blue chip ones that come to Hong Kong, basically after Art Basel came to Hong Kong, they opened spaces here because the market is, huge in this region. There are so many buyers to educate, not to educate for the sake of education, but to educate so they can buy. They know that, oh, that William Pentridge is valuable, right? They can distinguish. So it definitely has, it's, marketing, you can call it that, but it's of course, so that it's not so different than, opening a Louis Vuitton store, but you don't have to sell the things here. You just make sure everyone knows that the new bag is this, and then they will buy it, right? You know that it's a Louis Vuitton. So, but of course the artwork is even harder to distinguish because it's not branded like that. But it definitely impacts the local ecology as a consequence of pandemic. Actually, the galleries had a smaller version of Art Basel. And you can see there's much more community support because these big blue chip galleries, they're here, but less travel, right? So there was much more focus on what's happening. What are the artists in Hong Kong doing? What are they making? Are some more local buyers buying? Because as a consequence of these global players coming in, they're kind of elbowing out also because they're just huge and rich and glamorous that, they can outcompete very easily the local galleries. So not to mention the international competitiveness. Yeah.
And we still have 4 more questions. So it's a more intimate investigation about the art spaces, and it's more about the interaction between the artworks and visitors. So the audience is interested about the topic about the contemporary museum typology and also the artist spaces in Shanghai. And he would like to know if there's any examples of the architectural spaces or typological changes influenced particularly by photographing or observing people in front of artworks and their interaction with the artworks or the social media in Shanghai.
Social media influence. Social media is a huge driver, especially today, because it's like free PR marketing for not only art, but fashion and everything else. You have influencers who post and then everyone goes, right, to that spot. I think in that sense, space becomes also still, because the character of the space, in addition to the artwork, is quite important. So that's why a lot of these industrial reuse projects become very photogenic, because they have this patina that's not, the ambiance, the vibe becomes part of that experience that is being influential. Whether that influences the design of the architecture type, I think architects are always thinking how things look on like renderings and models, right? So we want it to be influencer friendly, but not only, of course, because you don't want to, but that aspect of the visuality, of course, is very important. In terms of how that inspires the plan or section, we haven't looked at it, but definitely the kind of, the 2-dimensional media of what that space is like, because it's so. But I think part of that question asks about the artist space too, right? Like the studio space, because that's also quite curious because the artists don't have to, because we think artists and we think, oh, industrial space, kind of concrete, spacious, light, lots of work or whatever work. And you'll be surprised to find that artists can work in many different places. And also, I haven't visited. I really wanted to. That was a plan for 2020, but then it never happened because of the pandemic. There's an area where the artists work in these suburban villas, and that's, you can never, you imagine like these cool artists, but then they're in some, desperate housewife kind of house, and they're working in there, and that's pretty awesome, right? Because it doesn't matter. It's kind of like, that's a new cool. So if any of you want to go and visit, please contact. I would love to be in touch. And there were a few spaces we wanted to document in Shanghai that were really interesting, but unfortunately, we can't share with you because we couldn't go survey them. And some of the artists moved out already. So. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for Professor Zhou's fascinating sharing tonight, and also James and George, great discussion. And yeah, I believe that it's been an inspiring evening or morning for all of our audience here. And thank you for all our audience to join us today for the Challenges lecture series. And we'll be sharing great ideas in the future. And see you, and hope you all safe and sound. And please enjoy the weekend. Yeah.
Yes, you too. Thank you so much. Thank you also to the audience. Everyone stay well. Good luck in the finals week also at the GSD. Yes, we're hitting that. Yes, here too.
Thank you so much, and hope to see you all in our next activities.
Yes.